Please welcome our panelists. Davina Durgana, Senior Statistician of Walk Free Foundation and the report co-author of the Global Slavery Index. Fengmin Gong, the head of DD Labs North America and the Vice President of Security Strategy at DD Chuxing. Betelhan Dessie, Project Manager at ICOG, Anyone Can Code, and Project Advisor, Solve It. And our moderator, reporter Jennifer Strong.
Welcome, everybody. How's it going? Good day? Excellent. Okay, so we have a very interesting mix here for you of folks. Very different backgrounds, using data in very different ways to solve really different challenges. A tech executive of a company uses massive amounts of user data, statistician using data to inform policy, and a tech pioneer using data to invent. So common thread is their impact on society. So given the very different backgrounds, what I'd like to start with is how each of you sees data and society, how they complement, and maybe how they conflict.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we always struggle, especially as people who work predominantly with data, to find a way to make that information and the outcomes from those analyses relevant to the societies we work with. So as a statistician that works specifically on the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking, it's been really challenging to find a way to make sure that our models of risk, resilience, prevalence, that they speak to the populations that we work with and still remain true to answering these types of questions about resource allocation and the best ways to try to help and intervene. So I think one of the ways that data and society kind of work together is that we are luckily in a place right now where there's a lot of information out there, a lot of information about risk factors, a lot of information about how resources are allocated. So that's an opportunity for us to work very well together. But then there's also a bit of a conflict. There are privacy concerns. There's some real risk in sharing data and using data in this way. And I think we're really navigating that space quite carefully.
Fengmin?
All right, yeah, great. I mean, definitely. If we look at this data, right, really empower a lot of things. But if I was going to look at it more closely, I probably would characterize it as it's definitely a challenge in the sense if we do not really think carefully about what we use the data for, and also the second aspect, how do we use it? And that's where it could have consequences. So it's really a challenge, probably less of a conflict. Of course, it may have negative consequences if we are not diligent.
My point would be in other developed countries where data is used to make decisions and such, in a developing country such as Ethiopia, it's really hard to find real-time data. And out of the 130 million population that we have, 85% of them are farmers, which are not able to create the data that is needed to make decisions and such. So it's kind of finding solutions to get these data from these farmers and also those who actually need the solutions to their problems. So while having the data is good, also having the right data matters, and we're trying to find creative ways in order to collect that data and use it in the right way.
Yeah. Now, you've said that in developing countries, tech creates comfort and convenience, but in Ethiopia, it creates necessity. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the necessity issues, there are a lot of startups coming up in different parts of the world, and they're creating cool and amazing innovations to, to create a business and also solve community problems. But the case in Ethiopia is the fact that there are really basic problems that haven't been solved yet. And this also is because of the infrastructure problem. And because of that, we have to find creative ways in order to tackle different problems that we have. For example, there is a kind of an app that allows refugees So there's a machine, and they select whether it's a cat, a dog, or identify animals and plants, while they make a small amount of money, while also training the machine to train it. So it's really interesting to find these kind of solutions to really basic problems that we have. So that's why tech is really a necessity.
Davina, now, as you said, your work applies analytical models to better understand human trafficking. I'm curious, have you seen groups use data more effectively in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a tremendous push, I would say, at the UN level and looking at this globally to really try to inform how we're meeting some of these benchmarks for the Sustainable Development Goals in particular. One of the Sustainable Development Goals really focuses on the measurement of modern slavery, and actually we're working with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the International Organization for Migration on one of the first ever programs to work with developed countries to try to measure modern slavery based on administrative lists of victim data. This requires much more than just the statistics behind it, though. This means that governments are willing to work together with nonprofits and international organizations. It means that we're finding ways to anonymize this data and to make it accessible safely. And it also means that the methods are being refined in a way that makes that even a reliable way of estimating slavery in places where we, at first, couldn't really get viable survey results. So it's changing in a lot of ways, and I think part of that is the openness of the community to talk about data and its importance. I think that's also being driven by innovations in technology and ways that we can share information safely, and also understanding how to communicate science and research to other stakeholders that need to be involved in these types of decisions.
All right, so Fengmin, Didi's apps are used by 500 million people worldwide. More than 30 million drivers have found work through your platform. It means that you're generating and collecting a massive amount of data. So how are you working to use it responsibly and be sure it doesn't perpetuate bias?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, also, as Davina was mentioning, I mean, there is definitely how you use the data and also how do you protect the data, right? If you don't protect the data, then when it gets leaked, it can also have consequences. So for us, we actually, because at the very beginning, data is such an essential part where to help you even just determine simple things like how do you match, right, dispatch a request into a driver, all the way to ensure the safety. And then you also have to be able to certify a driver to make sure the driver is indeed the driver, right, you were expecting. But I would put this in general based on what we have done, into a few key areas. And clearly when we come to deal with data, certain data would have to be kept in order for us to do the analysis, to learn things. And then, of course, there is the very first step where you need to make sure the data is encrypted, right, when it's stored everywhere. And then the second aspect is when you do actually use the data, try to generate and gain insight, you also have to deal with how do you anonymize the data. So that's where, because we have an ecosystem, we have to exchange data in order to actually derive the benefit of it. So then after that, then it really become when you pick the application, right, you're going to use to apply the data analysis to gain either improve the experience, right, of the user or improve the efficiency. You have to pick the right application in terms of how you are going to actually leverage the data. And then the other thing is very important is today, right, I think leveraging big data with the technology, a lot of people think you are going to let things run by itself. I think that's one key aspect. Also, we have to keep in mind, we need today, as we can see the technology, we need a human in the loop actually to do that verification to make sure. Yeah.
Sure. And you should feel free to chime in, ladies, if there's something you want to ask. Otherwise, Betelham, continuing with this conversation around bias for a moment. In your work with Anyone Can Code, what role does bias prevention play?
Yeah, so when you look into tech bias. I come from a company which works in AI and robotics. So it's not only, I always talk about, people say AI is evil, AI is that, but I would say the people who are doing it decide whether it's evil or not. And also the data that we use to power that AI was really matters. And it's not only those who develop the AI tools and systems, but also those who create the data, as I mentioned before. Because when you see a lot of data is being created by a lot of people online, and that's what people usually use to power the AIs, and not having that data of the people from the rural sides or the developed parts of the world would really make it biased. So we start very early. What I do is we teach young kids on how to code. Not only on how to code, but also digital literacy, so that they're able to create the data that's needed to make the decisions in the future. So I believe starting very early and creating the platform for people to contribute to the different systems that are being developed is very important in order to solve the bias.
But in the early stage of program design, you're taking steps.
Yeah, we are, because we believe that especially starting early, when you look into women in tech, there were not a lot of role models for the past 5 to 10 years. There were, but they were not promoted. So parents were not able to see what their children could achieve. And usually, in a country like mine, parents usually make the decisions for the children. So we're trying to give them a platform so that they can experience it and know about it, and also show them what they're able to create at a very early age before they have any assumptions of what they should be or what they could become.
Fengmin, I'm curious, how are you working with cross-sector partners? I mean, these are complex issues like transportation. And if you have advice for folks here in the audience as they go about building their own partnerships.
Yeah, that's a great question. Indeed, right? Actually, I come from a cybersecurity background, and one of the first things we realized was today with the network, right, with how the hacking are going, if we do not share intelligence, we know we actually are not even on an even playground with actually the underground. And of course, when we come today, as you said, to deal with the transportation problem, we indeed quickly realize, right, not only we have the passengers, right, we have the drivers, but also we are trying to deal with an issue that the local government have been involved, have been working for a long time, right? And they also have certain ways. So this is where, indeed, we realize that to be effective, probably it's better to start with the problem. If we look at the transportation, if we look at either it's basically lack of, right, basically people are not getting the rides they need, or it's the congestion, right? Those are the very, very common things. So we then kind of try to focus on the problem first. Once we have that problem, then we try to identify who are the stakeholders, right? You really need to get the stakeholders together, and then to actually then, once you have that, you basically have a common goal among the stakeholders. And then the technology actually come in. And this is where I get into the specifics and how you do it. Some of the interesting thing, just one quick example is what we have been doing is every city, right, with any reasonable size, they have a congestion problem. So then what we end up doing is using the trace data from the cars out on the road, only used about 5% of the data, sample data. But we are able to create prediction models in terms of time of the day, major traffic, major region of the city, and then use that prediction, then generate a configuration for the lights. Yeah. Instead of you having a static one, and then we have been doing that now at least over like 20 cities across China, and they are seeing the improvement in congestion from anywhere from 10 to 20%. So those are the things that we have done, and we feel we can apply the same kind of approach, right, in other places. Yeah.
And if I can, that example is perfect about building constituency around a common goal and a common problem and getting stakeholder buy-in. So I think a lot of times we maybe approach problems from like a silo. We think that the solution can only be found sometimes within our small fields or our like limited area of influence. But the reality is that we need a multi-stakeholder solution to a lot of these problems, and they do bring a lot of valuable information. I really appreciate your comments about sharing information even about the weaknesses, because that's really, really critical information to try to help find a solution and democratizing access to that data. And also for Betelham, your point about the idea of digital literacy at an early age, I think as we build comfort levels to these like more advanced solutions, I think that's going to become more and more critical, that policymakers, stakeholders, community groups, nonprofit leaders can understand and like appreciate these methods for what they are instead of seeing them as kind of this monolithic and confusing approach. And I think that'll have really positive externalities for all of us.
For sure. And on my own part with my reporting, I've spent a tremendous amount of time in the last really 18 months with cybersecurity executives from government to corporate. And if there is a theme that ties all of them, no matter what area of cybersecurity they're working in, it's this need for greater collaboration. And so it was interesting hearing you bring that up really at the start. Do you have any tips, by the way, Fengmin, for folks who are trying to collaborate, like other actionable things that folks can work with?
Yeah, I think in this kind of particular case, this is where some of the issue just come back to also refer to what Davina was saying. Even if you, from a technology point of view, even if you come up with a solution, in particular from someone, right, from technology side, you think it's a great solution, right? But you come from a background where you already know about technology. Yes. You just think it's cool. Then all of a sudden, you probably forgot how this technology, when it gets implemented, who is the one directly benefiting, who is the one actually basically affecting how the technology gets actually experienced or touches the end user, right? In this particular example, we have been doing things, for example, in order to improve the safety and to help the driver and the passengers. Then we implement things where we would do even you mentioned the video earlier, right? We actually use a video to verify, right? The face recognition, verify if it's the right driver, right car. But then we have to also think about for a driver, right? It's on the road for a couple of hours or a few hours, right? How you make that experience. Mm-hmm. So it's in such a way, right? In terms of when you do it. How you require the driver to actually basically work with the system, because otherwise, and all of a sudden, you just kind of affect negatively the driver's experience. Right. So this is where, in addition to looking at the technology and solve a given problem, we actually regularly go out to reach out to the drivers, do this kind of like a focus group. Yes. And just to see what people feel, what they need, right, in the field, and then come back and then try to improve the product. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in about the topic you raised about sharing intelligence, which I think is very important. I believe that AI could have went a long way if collaboration started very early, especially with the big companies like Google and Facebook, which have a lot of data, and a lot of organizations trying to build their own AI tools. But it's not shared, and the data is not shared, so they cannot build upon it. So sharing intelligence, I think, and also having people contribute to it would go a great length, and it will help really develop the AI tools and also decision-making tools that people are developing. And yeah, I think sharing intelligence is really cool.
And if I can say, the idea of the focus group, I think, is so critical. So especially in our research with something like modern slavery, that's really hard to explain to people that might be experiencing forms of forced labor or exploitation in their own lives, we actually find that these cognitive testing groups, before we do these surveys, are critical so that we can make sure that the concepts we're asking about resonate with the communities we're working in. We also do something very similar with our findings in survivor engagement groups to make sure that what we're finding and what we're recommending is relevant and useful and sensitively worded for communities that are going to be impacted by that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you some more about that. So the Global Slavery Index, that's the Foundation's flagship report, so it shed light on a lot of the complexities of modern slavery, but I'm wondering if you have any insights to share with folks about the use of data for broader decision-making like this, what you've learned.
Absolutely, thank you. So the Global Slavery Index, we've been doing this for a long time, and I have to say that every single year, we started in 2012, and so every single year that we've worked on an edition, it gets much, much better. The data becomes more representative, we get more stakeholder groups, more partnerships, we feed into this like global data set of information. So we've learned quite a lot. Some of the ways that we influence policymaking is we have a government response database. So over the last 8 years, we've been looking at what we think would construct the perfect response from a government. And no government will really ever reach this, but it includes things like supply chain transparency. It looks at the social safety nets that are developed. How is migration regulated and treated? How are birth registration items addressed? Things kind of like that we think contribute to either risk and resilience in slavery. We do something very similar with a vulnerability model that I construct that looks at kind of how do we build a risk profile. Then we complement that with our survey research. What we found specifically is that state-imposed forced labor is a huge problem that has really not received a lot of attention. Part of that is because of how inaccessible a lot of the authoritative regimes that practice this will be. So we take that quite seriously. We partner with groups when we must. There's a really amazing group at Leiden University that we worked with on North Korean defector research and talking to them about not just the research that we were able to collaborate on at the UN level and reports of like what we knew was going on, but we also wanted to make sure that was contextualized with people who had experienced that to kind of give us the sense of what does forced labor when it's state imposed look like. And then of course that's compounded with situations of conflict and particularly when you're looking at forced conscription, Eritrea, Burundi, you're looking at a lot of different variations on a very similar trend. Effectively a national government that was charged with the protection of these groups, then profiting or mandating the kind of forced labor that we're seeing. And in a lot of ways, that's something that's really critical that we touch on, because if the government itself is complicit, there are very few other alternatives beyond the international community to really engage to try to protect those people.
You know, and I want to ask you, because it's not going to be obvious to all of us, right? What are some of your data sources that folks would not guess necessarily?
Oh, of course. Well, so some that I think some people maybe are not aware of. We have a global research program with Gallup World Poll, and those are nationally representative surveys in actually 48 countries as of the 2018 edition. So it's a pretty large number of countries that we do nationally representative surveys asking about forced labor and actually also forced marriage, which is a really important corollary. So in our field, it hasn't always been accepted that forced marriage is necessarily a form of slavery. And I do say forced marriage instead of child marriage because child marriage is so prevalent, particularly in Southeast Asia and a lot of places around the world with very high populations, that if we were looking at child marriage, that number would be millions more than it is. We're talking about forced marriage, which typically when you're measuring something like this at a global level, you have to be very conservative. So what we're talking about are pretty much the most egregious forms of this modern slavery. So it's not enough that there's like a lot of ambiguity about whether force was or wasn't present. Typically our respondents have to be very clear that there was an element of force, this was not their free will, and typically that there was a commercial element, often like a dowry or some kind of land exchange. So I think it's a very fascinating process when you think really about what it means to have a global survey program that tries to measure this. Some of the other data sources we use that are really interesting, I mentioned that program we're working on with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the International Organization for Migration in Europe, where we're working with the developed countries to measure prevalence. We have not yet implemented that in the index. That'll be in future iterations. But one of the most exciting pieces is that as someone who lives in the United States, I'm really thrilled that we finally have a way to quantify what happens in some of these countries. Whereas in the past, the survey programs really only work in developing countries, given the sample size and how likely it is to find. So I think that we're getting to a point now where we can start using other types of data. Like for developed countries this year, the G20 countries, we measured how much worth of goods, money and goods, that they are importing from at-risk countries that are using forced labor. And so when you think about that, cocoa, timber, all these electronics, Vietnam apparel industries. Like when you think about all of the stuff that's actually coming into G20 countries, it's amazing how we're fueling this global demand for cheap goods and labor. So I think that's kind of like an enlightening area.
If I can add, just along the line of both using the data and also some of the collaboration, one other interesting example we have was when we went to extend the service to Brazil. You know, one of the things for providing rides, in particular the pooling kind of service, is very important to pick the pickup points that are both safe and convenient, right? And a lot of people have hard time finding where they were going to pick it up. So we use this notion of point of interest, right? But that data, it has a lot of local culture and aspects to it. So when we go to Brazil, I mean, we have to actually reach out to partners and also collect, have a way of, from like passenger and driver, right, to feedback to you. So that's one aspect of it where you have to recognize, you have to localize, and then leverage that data for a better service. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So as we start to wrap up here, I'm going to ask you all to get out your crystal balls and just, I want your thoughts on how you predict data can be used for good in the future, will be used for good in the future. Betelham?
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of ways data can be used for good. How everything, data, decision making and such. But what I want to focus on is the democracy of how data is actually distributed and also how data is used, because that really worries me, and because there are a lot of examples that are being given, but one of the very famous examples is a word association AI tool, which does, for example, men is to women, so men is to brother as women is to sister, right? So men is to king as women is to queen. But when you ask this tool, men is to doctor as women is to what? It responds with a nurse. It doesn't necessarily mean that all women are nurses, but this means not only the AI tool is creating a bias, but the data that's been fed into that tool created that bias. And I think thinking about where the data comes from and how it's used and who's generating it really matters. And in order to do that, we need to educate the people who are creating that data. And I believe it's a really important thing that we should look into, especially in areas where there's a limited or little to access to real-time data. And I believe data can be used for good, but it's also a very, very powerful tool that we should be careful about, especially in the hands of bad people, or bad, not necessarily bad, but people who are not considering this kind of what do you say it? Measures, taking major measures before they use the data and how they use it.
Yeah.
So I think that's important.
Keep us on time here. My fingers are crossed. It's said a lot, but I hope that 2019 really is the year that data bias becomes mainstream and a little more understood. Fengmin?
Yes, absolutely. I think those are great points. I mean, overall, of course, I'm very optimistic, right? We can do good things. I mean, then really the key comes to what problem we try to solve, right? And then in that process, how we do it. If you look at, think of some of the sweet spots, right? Relatively maybe less risk is going to be, first of all, use the data to understand what we are doing to our environment, to our own health, right? I mean, there are a lot of things we can learn actually by looking at the data. And then the second aspect is when we do have the problem, I think looking at the data broadly indeed help us to gain insights into those problems. So those are the ones relatively safe. Then the moment you get into building some of the models, then try to do prediction, classification. This is where we have to absolutely be very, very judicious. We have to indeed ask how do we collect the training data in that process? I mean, that's where the inherent bias comes in. And that bias, depending on the application, when you use a model, it's going to introduce at least the unintended consequences, right? Depending on how you use the application for, you could, from little nuisance, right, if it's like office, right, entering an office using face recognition. which is okay. If you fail to recognize an employee, she or he can still use the badge. But if you turn it around, start using it for surveillance, and then you can see that can have serious impact, right? And that is where you have to answer those questions. And also the last point is, I think given the current state of the art, it's always very important to have human in the loop to actually verify. So, yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. I think what you touched on there, the idea that these models aren't just made to describe the world as it is. Our goal is that in the short term or the near future, that we can actually be proactive about the things that are putting real lives at risk. That we can understand this well enough to be able to have a good sense of where actual impacts can be made from investing in intervention money. Like, it's not just something that we can be guessing at anymore. I think there are real consequences, real people's lives at stake, and all of this will be exacerbated by climate change. It'll all be exacerbated by refugees and continued conflict. So I think when we're looking at this, my goal for the future is that we are able to take all of the great work we've done, the really cautious work that we're done, the very thoughtful work that we've done, and start to create models that can help us be better at preempting these types of conflicts. I don't want to see another Syrian conflict where we just don't know where people are going. We just don't have systems in place. We just don't know how to protect migrant children, men, women that are on the move and incredibly vulnerable. I don't want that to happen again, but then Venezuela occurs and the same situation is happening. Then I want us to be able to predict those situations in advance. And sociologically, empirically, we can start to try to do that and build these resilience models around that.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much to our panelists.
Thank you.